Sir Thomas Wyatt was more than a courtier with a gift for words. He was a man whose life unfolded against the turbulent backdrop of Henry VIII's reign, a world of shifting alliances, dangerous intrigue and sudden reversals of fortune. Though best remembered today for introducing the sonnet into English literature, Wyatt was also a diplomat, a one-time prisoner of the Tower of London, and a figure whose personal story has long been entangled with that of Anne Boleyn. Thomas's life shows us a vivid window into the volatile world of Tudor England. So let's explore his story. Welcome back to the Tudor Chess Podcast, episode 123, The Life of Sir Thomas Wyatt, Poet and Prisoner, with me, Adam Pennington. Thomas Wyatt was born in 1503 at Allington Castle, near Maidstone in Kent. His family traced its roots back to Yorkshire, but had risen in prominence by supporting the Lancastrian cause in the Wars of the Roses. His father, Sir Henry Wyatt, embodied the risks of that turbulent era, for he had been imprisoned and possibly tortured during the reign of King Richard III. Legend has it that he was even kept in the Tower of London with only a cat for company. Henry Wyatt later became a trusted counsellor of King Henry VII. His loyalty was rewarded with power, lands and influence, which he carried into the reign of King Henry VIII. This legacy set the stage for young Thomas. His mother was Anne Skinner, and she came from a well-connected Surrey family, again in the southeast of England. Thomas had at least two siblings, Margaret, who married into the Lee family and became the mother to Sir Henry Lee, a significant courtier during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, and he had a brother, Henry, who sadly died young. Although no official record survives, John Leland reported that Thomas Wyatt attended Cambridge University, and it's often assumed that he studied at St John's College, where he showed early promise. He excelled in languages and classical studies, acquiring the linguistic dexterity that would later allow him to translate Petrarch and experiment with Italian poetic form. Contemporary accounts describe Thomas Wyatt as tall, well over 6 foot, handsome, physically strong and charismatic, qualities that made him stand out at the Tudor court. He first entered Henry VIII's court in 1515 as a sewer extraordinary, a ceremonial role that brought him into the king's orbit. This early position was largely symbolic, but it provided the perfect stepping stone into royal service. In 1520, he married Elizabeth Brooke, daughter of Thomas Lord Cobham, and a year later their son Thomas was born, thereafter known as Thomas Wyatt the Younger. By 1524, Thomas Wyatt was already rising in royal service as an esquire of the body to the king and a clerk of the jewels. These posts, likely gained through both familial connections and his own aptitude, were more significant than their modest titles suggest. They placed him firmly within the king's household, where personal influence and access to Henry VIII were hotly contested among courtiers. Not long after the birth of his son, probably around 1525, Thomas Wyatt grew estranged from his wife Elizabeth. Biographers generally attribute this separation to her alleged unfaithfulness, a rumour recorded at the time when a Spanish chronicler bluntly noted that Wyatt had cast his wife away on account of adultery. In 1526, he travelled with Sir Thomas Cheney on a diplomatic mission to the French court, marking the start of a long career in international service. In 1527, he was actually approached by Queen Catherine of Aragon, who asked him to translate a piece of Petrarch's work, but instead Wyatt turned down the post and found something more meaningful for him, instead taking on Guillaume Bude's Latin rendering of Plutarch's On Tranquility and Peace of Mind. Published by Richard Pryson in 1528 as The Quiet of Mind, the text resonated deeply with Thomas Wyatt, who was fast becoming famous for his love of poetry, and echoes of its ideas surfaced throughout the rest of his work as a poet. Between 1528 and late 1530, Thomas Wyatt served as High Marshal of Calais, and in 1532 he became Commissioner of the Peace in Essex. By then, Henry VIII's court was not just a centre of politics, but also of art. Poets, musicians and courtiers competed for recognition. The fashion of the day was poetry of courtly love, rooted in the troubadour tradition of France, men casting women as divine, unattainable beings, always desired but never possessed. Wyatt absorbed this style and gave it his own stamp. His verse is full of frustrated suitors, cruelly chaste women, and the ache of unfulfilled desire. But Thomas Wyatt wasn't just copying a trend. He had access to European poetry through his travels, especially the works of Petrarch, whose sonnets were reshaping literature across the continent. Wyatt was one of the first to bring the sonnet into English, translating and adapting Petrarch's verses. His experiments laid the groundwork for the great Elizabethan flowering of poetry. At court, Wyatt's poems circulated in manuscript form, passed hand to hand like private secrets. Everyone knew who wrote them, and sometimes who they were about, even if they weren't physically signed. This was all part of the game. Public devotion cloaked as art, with just enough ambiguity to preserve appearances. But in such a closed world, where everyone knew everyone else's business, poetry could also prove to be dangerous. It is impossible, of course, to discuss Wyatt and the women around him without addressing the persistent rumour of his affection for Anne Boleyn. Thomas Wyatt had known Anne since youth. His father's role as Constable of Norwich Cathedral had linked the Wyatt family to the Boleyns, and it's highly likely that the two were well acquainted before Anne caught King Henry VIII's eye. Whether Wyatt and Anne ever shared a romantic relationship is uncertain, and certainly, in my opinion, highly unlikely. But his poetry does fuel speculation. His famous sonnet, Whoso list to hunt, has long been interpreted as a veiled reference to Anne, portraying her as a deer pursued by hunters, ultimately claimed by Caesar, Henry VIII himself. The lines Noli me tangere for Caesar's I am suggest resignation, as though Wyatt acknowledged that Anne was forever beyond his reach. Wyatt is also partly responsible for affirming that Anne had dark hair, for he labelled her as a brunette. Wyatt's grandson, George Wyatt, later claimed that Thomas wore a jewel belonging to Anne, a locket taken, perhaps, in a moment of flirtation. According to this story, Henry VIII spotted the jewel during a game of bowls and grew suspicious, prompting Anne to claim that Wyatt had taken it without her permission. Though the tale may be apocryphal, it reflects how deeply contemporaries and later generations associated Wyatt with Anne's story. Of course, even if Wyatt and Anne Boleyn did have some form of relationship, once Henry VIII had set his eyes upon Anne, there was little that she or Wyatt could do. As such, Wyatt himself became entrusted with assisting in the king's great matter, seeing himself sent on a diplomatic mission abroad to Spain and later to Rome, where he worked alongside Sir John Russell in petitioning Pope Clement VII to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. This was not a mere formality, it was at the very heart of Henry's great matter, his obsessive desire to set aside Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn. Wyatt's diplomatic assignments reveal the precariousness of Tudor foreign policy. Rome was a dangerous posting. In 1527, for example, the troops of Emperor Charles V stormed the city, imprisoning the Pope and wreaking havoc. Some accounts suggest that Thomas Wyatt himself may have been caught up in the crisis, possibly even taken prisoner before escaping. Such experiences underline the personal risks that Tudor envoys faced, serving a monarch whose ambitions often placed his servants in impossible situations. This was nothing, however, compared to the very real threat at home that would engulf Thomas in May of 1536. On the 2nd of May of that year, infamously, Queen Anne Boleyn was arrested on a charge of adultery, incest, and conspiring the king's death. Alongside her, there would be a total of 7 men who were also arrested. This is repeatedly and inaccurately stated as being 5. 5 men would die, but 2 would not. These were Sir Richard Page and, as he was then known, Sir Thomas Wyatt. Page and Wyatt would be imprisoned in the Tower of London just as the other arrestees, but they would escape with their lives. The reason for this was a simple one. They were close to Thomas Cromwell. If ever proof is needed of just how corrupt the entire affair of May 1536 is, we only have to look at this as a case study. Wyatt was long rumoured to have had some sort of former relationship with Anne, or at very least had been openly flirtatious with her. Ostensibly, there was therefore much more to try and pin on Wyatt with Anne Boleyn, far more so than, say, between Anne and William Brereton, who may have never even met Anne Boleyn, but Brereton, unlike Wyatt, was no friend of Cromwell's. Wyatt was. I believe Cromwell used Wyatt and Page as something of a smokescreen. He knew that the charges that he was concocting would look ludicrous to a lot of people, and so by adding in 2 other men, including one with a rumoured former dalliance with Anne, it would add weight to the charges. Cromwell could then have any charges against Wyatt and Page, who, again, he was on friendly terms with, removed once the other men had been condemned. We know, thanks to perhaps Thomas Wyatt's most famous poem, exactly where he was lodged in the Tower of London, and that from his cell he watched the executions of the 5 men found guilty of adultery with the Queen: Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, Mark Smeaton, and, most infamously of all, Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. The 5 men were led to the scaffold on Tower Hill on the 17th of May, where they were beheaded. While the poem that Wyatt wrote is titled "In Mourning Whoso List," its most famous line, "These bloody days have broken my heart, my lust, my youth did them depart," is the basis for why it is most commonly known as These Bloody Days. The poem reflects both personal anguish and political caution. Wyatt mourns the deaths of these men that he had known at court, acknowledging their innocence, even as he carefully avoids blaming the king directly. His grief is complicated by fear. He was, after all, still alive only by the king's mercy and Thomas Cromwell's connivances. Wyatt contrasts his own fate, spared but imprisoned, with the executed men who went the way that I have gone. The sense of survivor's guilt permeates the verse, as does the recognition that fortune at Henry VIII's court could swiftly turn from triumph to ruin. What makes the poem extraordinary is its balance between raw emotion and restrained expression. Wyatt does not write as a detached observer, but as someone who nearly shared in these men's fate. His lines tremble with sorrow, but also with the careful self-control of a man who knew that his words might someday be read by the very king in whose hands his life was now held. In the Tower, Wyatt had witnessed the collapse of Anne Boleyn's circle and the execution of the men that he had jousted with, debated with, and in some cases was probably friends with. His poetry records not just their deaths, but the atmosphere of dread and uncertainty that defined life at Henry VIII's court. The language is deeply personal and shows us how horrific the deaths of these men were and how much it broke Thomas Wyatt's heart. Now, poets are famous for wearing their heart on their sleeves, but even so, lines such as "The bell tower showed me such a sight, that in my head sticks day and night," still strike a chord 500 years later. It's also thanks to that line that we can confirm that Thomas Wyatt was housed in the bell tower, in the same cell that had previously been occupied by Bishop John Fisher. Now, I've been lucky enough to actually go into this cell at the Tower of London, which is permanently closed off to the public. As you can expect, it's a very sombre place, but it was very moving to stand there and to look directly out of the window where once Thomas Wyatt stood, me looking down over 21st century London, whilst Thomas Wyatt looked down on a bloodbath. It was also during the 1530s, however, that Wyatt had formed a lasting relationship with Elizabeth Darrell, who remained his mistress for the rest of his life. A number of his poems, such as "A Face That Should Content Me Wondrous Well" and "So Feeble Is the Thread," almost certainly point to this bond. Darrell was a former maid of honour to Catherine of Aragon and would bear Thomas Wyatt 3 sons, and though he would never formally recognise them, they were part of his extended family network. These complicated relationships show Wyatt as both a man of his age, living within the fluid morality of the Tudor court, and as someone caught between duty, desire, and reputation. Wyatt's career continued in spite of the setbacks that he had come up against in May of 1536. As I hinted at earlier, he had been knighted the year before in 1535, thereafter becoming Sir Thomas Wyatt, and was appointed High Sheriff of Kent in 1536. That same year, in November 1536, his father died, and by 1537 Wyatt was once again engaged abroad, this time as ambassador to the court of the Emperor Charles V. During this mission, he wrote a poignant letter to his son, urging him to model himself on the example of his grandfather, Sir Henry Wyatt, rather than on his own father's life, which he admitted had been marked by folly and unthriftiness, leading to dangers and hazards, enmities, hatreds, imprisonments, and indignations. In the same letter, he admonished his son to ground his life upon God and goodness. Henry VIII's foreign policy during these years sought to prevent Charles V and Francis I of France from forging a Catholic alliance against England. Although Wyatt returned home in 1538, Charles and Francis reached their own settlement in Nice without England, raising the threat of invasion. Wyatt's poem Tejas Farewell likely belongs to this period. Like his letter to his son, the poem has been mined by scholars to interpret his character. Despite hardships, imprisonments, and his frank criticisms of the court, Wyatt emerges as a loyal servant to Henry. The closing lines of Tejas Farewell emphasise that fidelity. My king, my country, alone for whom I live, of mighty love the wings of this me give. While Thomas was in Spain, he naturally faced hostility over Henry VIII's treatment of Princess, later Lady Mary, who was Charles V's cousin. His mission was therefore largely unsuccessful, and jealous colleagues accused Wyatt of disloyalty. His diplomatic service also meant that he saw firsthand the physical costs of serving Henry VIII. Ambassadors were expected to pay their own expenses, which often meant running up debts or leaning on family wealth. Wyatt, even after inheriting a fortune in 1537, was notoriously bad with money. Still, he served faithfully, travelling to France, the papal court in Rome, and across the rest of Italy. In Rome, he was briefly left in charge of a mission after his superior was injured, only to be captured by the forces of Emperor Charles V. Henry VIII paid the ransom, but held Wyatt liable for the debt. In 1539, Wyatt was again sent abroad, this time charged with tracking Charles V's movements through France and discerning his intentions towards England. By mid-1540, however, after Henry VIII's marriage to Anne of Cleves and the subsequent decline in trust between Charles and Francis, the danger of a Catholic coalition had faded and Wyatt safely returned home. On the 28th of July 1540, however, his greatest patron, Thomas Cromwell, was executed. Cromwell's downfall stemmed partly from opposition to his religious and diplomatic policies from the conservative corners of court, and partly from Henry's personal distaste from his arranged marriage with Anna of Cleves. A Spanish chronicle even reports that at the scaffold at Cromwell's execution, he asked Wyatt to pray for him, but that Wyatt was overcome with emotion and could barely speak. Cromwell had, after all, been Wyatt's main protector at court. With his fall from power, anyone tied too closely to him looked vulnerable. Wyatt was accused of being Cromwell's ally, of taking bribes in his diplomatic service, and even of treasonous correspondence while ambassador in Spain, including accusations of communications with Reginald Pole. On those charges, Wyatt was once again sent to the Tower of London. This time, his situation was extremely dangerous. His future looked doomed. Wyatt, however, put up an extremely eloquent defence, destabilising the charges put against him. But, in a twist of fate, the young woman who had married Henry VIII on the very day that Cromwell was executed would be highly instrumental in getting Wyatt's liberty back for him. I'm speaking, of course, of Catherine Howard. Now, we cannot say exactly why Catherine Howard was so sympathetic to Wyatt, but she reportedly interceded with her husband on Wyatt's behalf, pleading for his release. The king agreed, but a certain condition was forced upon Thomas Wyatt, namely that he reconcile with his estranged wife Elizabeth Brooke, a reminder that even his private life was subject to royal scrutiny. By 1542, Wyatt was back in Henry's good graces. He was granted lands, including the site of the recently dissolved Boxley Abbey as part of the spoils of the dissolution of the monasteries. Yet his reprieve was short-lived, not through any fault of his own, but through failing health. In October that year, while travelling on royal business, Wyatt collapsed with a fever near Sherborne in Dorset. He died shortly afterwards at the relatively young age of 39, only outliving his elderly father by 5 years, and was buried thereafter in Sherborne Abbey. Thomas left behind an equally well-known and aforementioned briefly discussed son of the same name, Thomas Wyatt the Younger, who would famously rise up in rebellion against Queen Mary I, for which he would lose his head. During his lifetime, as I also discussed earlier, Wyatt's poems circulated privately among courtiers, copied by hand into manuscripts like the Devonshire manuscript. It was not until 1557, 15 years after his death, that his work appeared in print, in Tottle's anthology that shaped the course of English Renaissance poetry. 96 poems were attributed to Wyatt within that collection, including 31 sonnets, 10 of which were translations of Petrarch. The Egerton manuscript, partly in Wyatt's own hand, preserves 123 pieces of his work and remains one of the most important sources of Wyatt's poetry. Scholars continue to debate the exact canon of his writings, with hundreds of additional poems attributed to him over the centuries. Modern philological studies, however, suggest a more precise, evidence-based body of work. So Thomas Wyatt's life was a balancing act between power and peril, art and survival. He lived dangerously close to Henry VIII's shifting moods, suffering imprisonment and narrowly escaping execution, yet through it all, he transformed English literature. His poetry introduced a new elegance and introspection, bringing medieval traditions with the innovations of the Renaissance. He may have not achieved the polish of later poets, but his work carries a personal urgency that makes him feel oddly modern, even today. Through his verses, we hear the voice of a man caught in love, jealousy, fear, and ambition, a courtier who knew too well the fragility of favour, and a poet who left behind a legacy that outlasted the king who nearly destroyed him. In truth, no poet reflected the tangled politics and culture of Henry VIII's court more vividly than Sir Thomas Wyatt, a man of many talents, diplomat, courtier, jouster, and, most famously, a poet. He earned both admiration and jealousy from those around him. The boundary between his public duties and private life was never clearly drawn, for he spent most of his years in and around court circles, writing for an audience of fellow nobles who shared his world. It was within this environment that Wyatt helped shape a new English literary voice. By experimenting with rhythm and tone and blending continental and classical influences with native tradition, he laid the groundwork for a distinctly English style of poetry. He was the first to craft English sonnets and true satire, and through them engaged directly with the most urgent political and religious upheavals of his time, the Protestant Reformation and the Tudor crown's consolidation of power. For this fusion of poetic innovation with historical consciousness, he stands today as the central English poet of the early 16th century. His life was short, brilliant, and dangerous. He left behind not only a body of poetry that changed English verse forever, but also the story of a man who survived longer than most in the deadly orbit of King Henry VIII. That brings me to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. Thank you very much for listening. Next week, I'm back to having a guest on the podcast, and I'm pleased to be welcoming back a friend of the podcast, and all-round historical legend that is Dr. Elizabeth Norton for a discussion about one of the most fascinating women in all of English history, but one who is perhaps best known for the major role that she played during the Wars of the Roses. I'm speaking of the she-wolf of France, Margaret of Anjou. That will drop next Thursday. If you've got any suggestions for future podcast episodes, please do drop me a message. I would love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess Podcast, and chat to you next week.